emphasis of it is some type of change. It could be any type of change. There's usually a driver, and then there's the response. The change is the response. The driver is what's making that thing change, right? So I think that's really the concept, and in a nutshell. And what it really is kind of gets back to the old classic science theory of you make observations, right? This is kind of like the old, I don't know who was the original scientist that came up with this, but it's what you learn in science is you make observations in the world, and then you come up with a question or an idea like, oh, that seems to be changing. That doesn't seem to be. Why is that bird's beak that way, or why is the turtle only live on that island, or whatever? And then you go out and you collect data, and you collect data to test your hypothesis, your question, and then you come up with a theory of why that change is happening. So this is just kind of that basic science method. So one of the changes they're talking about that we do a lot in marsh environments is the change in the elevation. So those salt marshes are staying in place over time. They're actually growing over time and building up. That marsh is 1,000 years old and it's deep. The sediment's deep. And so how is that happening? And then you have sea level rise going to flood the marsh. Is the marsh keeping up? So this is a simple thing of like detecting elevation, right? So that one's a bigger one that's more similar to the tools we use. This is a smaller one we just make with skewers. But the idea is that you put this on in a container somewhat like this, and you put some sand in the bottom. You create an elevation, and you drop these pins. You slide these pins down until they're all just touching the sand. So it could be a shape like that. It could be a very flat shape. It's kind of like those things you push your hand in the pin thing or whatever, right? And in fact, if you have one of those, you can use that to kind of start this whole thing off. But in marshes, it's very flat, and then you add more sand. And then you put this back at the same known point, like on top of this. This can't move, this bar can't move, it always has to be put relative to that thing. And then you'll see that you got to raise these pins up. And what you're doing is you measure the amount of pins that are sticking above this surface. And when things are accreting or building up, then obviously these pins are going to start sliding up. And so you take the measurements here, and it'll show you how many centimeters. And if things are decreasing in elevation, these pins are going to slide down, and what you're doing is you're measuring the amount of the pins that are sticking up above it. So it's you're getting the change in elevation over time. That's actually what the scientists do out in the marsh. They're called surface elevation tables. They drop these pins. It's literally just that with stainless steel and things that don't. You've got to watch for thermal expansion of the pins. You have to use the same pins every year. You have to put them in the same holes. That's like the controlling other. So that's an important concept. Like. Are all these things the same height? Are all these skewers? I don't know what the standard are for making skewers, but they're probably not exactly the same height. So if you start changing the skewers around, you can get different numbers. So that's control of experiment, all those types of concepts. So this is taught in there as a surface elevation table, which is, again, you could build it more complicated. And this is what we do in the marsh: is you slide the pin until it drops down, and then you just slide the clip down to hold it right at the surface, so you're not pressing down into the sand or into the marsh. And then you're measuring this area, right? And then all of a sudden, the year goes by. I was going to throw that thing down on the ground, but you guys get the concept. You put another layer of sediment down, and this pin becomes, at this point, and then you take the measurement again, right? So
in the salt marsh, what is the reference point for the base?
Okay, good. I like the way you think. See, that's one of the trickiest things in here. You have to have a base that doesn't move, right? A reference point that doesn't move. So obviously in this control, the reference point contains the marsh, so the reference point doesn't move. But in the marsh, the reference point is a rod that's driven about 300 feet into the ground.
300.
Yeah. Wow.
It's called, so there's stainless steel rods there, and we take jackhammers and we drive them into the marsh, and you put what's called a benchmark in. Okay? And that's actually that's how the whole world is done. That's how George Washington did it, when he was stretching across he was a surveyor, and you start at a known location. I think back then it was probably the center of Philadelphia in the square or whatever, and they start their instruments right from that point, and they do all their elevations from that point, and eventually they march their way back to that point, and what's called close the loop. And they should have ended back at the same elevation they started at, which is 0. So you start at some elevation. You don't need to know what that elevation is it's just the base elevation, and everything's referenced to that. So that kind of gets to if you're measuring people's height or things like that. when your reference point is the ground, you know. So meaning you change your shoes, then your height changes. Then your height didn't actually change. So it's the reference point's a good concept that people don't often, even adults don't normally think about this. Like you have to have a set reference point. So that's what we do in marshes. And we reason that to drive the rods in so far is because we're in sand. But if you're on, you know, Mount Monadnock or you're on, you know, a granite outcrop, you just put a benchmark, you know, in a piece of rock, and that rock is not moving except as the whole Earth is moving, right? But you can't have that reference point moving. That's what I was saying. With the, you know, when I put this back on there, when you put this back, you have to put it back at the same spot, touching the same area, or you're getting a different answer. So